Steve Marrin, and I'm going to be giving a talk on the role of political science in American intelligence studies. But the first thing that I'm going to do is start with a comment about the broader theme, the role of social and behavioral science research in intelligence studies. And the reason that I'm going to comment on the broader theme is because I've spent about 15 years now contributing to different aspects of this kind of interdisciplinary research or dialogue. Comparing intelligence analysis specifically, because that's my own kind of primary area of specialization, to medicine, to science, to social science, to history, to anthropology, to legal reasoning, to journalism, and to many other fields. And the goal is to contribute to understanding about intelligence as a function of government and ideas for improving practice. But the intent is to do kind of contribute to both aspects of that, knowledge for intelligence and knowledge about intelligence. And as chair of ISA's Intelligence Studies section, I'm in a bit of a privileged position in terms of being able to facilitate this project by asking others to contribute in this space. And so I've kind of started to call this a study into comparative applied epistemology, because epistemology is the study of how you know what you know, and each applied field does a form of it, although they don't always do it in the same way. When you talk about people who are trying to understand in different fields, they are trying to understand, they're trying to explain, in some cases shape the world around them, and they all use different methodologies and procedures associated with doing so. But there isn't necessarily a best way to know and understand. And so what we're talking about is kind of constructing this Venn diagram of different ways of knowing and understanding and looking for the overlaps into the intelligence space. And in a form of like advertisement or something to look for in the future, there's a special issue of the journal Intelligence and National Security, which is going to be coming out later this year. The theme is going to be understanding and improving intelligence analysis by learning from other disciplines. And it's specifically going to be oriented to qualitative social science research design and methodology per Patrick Walsh, or the use of case studies in social scientific research per Eric Dahl, or Aaron Frank on computational social sciences and its contribution to intelligence analysis. I'll roll through. There are 10 different articles contributing to this from various different perspectives, including Steve Coulthard on policy analysis. And the reason that I start broad before I start narrowing into political science is because I'm more in the intelligence studies space than I am in the political science space, right? At least that's where I am currently. So why am I looking at political science? Well, because I started out as a political scientist. My undergraduate degree was in political science, my master's degree was in political science, so a PhD degree was in a subfield of political science. But my PhD wasn't funded, and while I was working on it, I needed a job. And so I moved away from political science and towards more policy-oriented version of intelligence studies, which in my case is a kind of policy analysis, intelligence analysis, policy analysis. Because for me, that's where the jobs were, which I suppose makes me a kind of a lapsed political scientist. Now, I used to do it, but haven't been there in a while. And I do have to kind of reinforce something that Mark Fithian said in his opening comments. As a step-back comment, American research universities tend to treat intelligence studies as if it's an experiential field rather than a scholarly one. For the most part, and with some notable exceptions, including this institution, but for the most part, research universities don't hire intelligence studies scholars as full-time faculty, and instead they rely upon adjuncts, current or former practitioners, to teach intelligence studies courses based more on experience than on theory or scholarship. Now, in the political science space, this is having a net effect that is significantly degrading, in my opinion, it's significantly degrading the development of intelligence studies scholarship from a political science perspective in the United States. And this is to the point that Amy Ziegert has suggested that political scientists are not studying intelligence much at all, and that's, for the most part, true. I mean, if you look at the content of the American Political Science Association's annual conference, it has 1 or 2 panels on intelligence studies topics, which usually struggle for both purchase and attendance. Meanwhile, intelligence studies as a policy-relevant interdisciplinary research project is growing significantly, which you can see in the growth, basically 300% growth in the total number of papers and panels on intelligence studies section-sponsored panels at the International Studies Association Conference. What this means in the political science space is that it's pushing much of the intelligence studies scholarship into the policy relevant sphere, rather than being tied more closely to the traditional academic disciplines, such as political science. So how this affects me, I got caught up in this. And because of the pressures, I shifted away from political science, and not entirely by choice. And over the past 15 years, as I've moved clearly into what is a conceptual, policy-relevant intelligence studies space, I've still wanted to re-engage with political science, but I've had difficulty finding the right opportunities to do that. And then Steve asked me to speak at this conference, and I was like, hey, this is a real cool opportunity, so I can talk about political science and how it might contribute to intelligence studies. And so what that meant for me was to go back to the graduate research that I had done when I was a student doing my master's and PhD. This is between 15 and 20 years ago now. And how those concepts and theories might help explain aspects of intelligence as a function of government more effectively. And when you look at political science, from the breadth and depth of the different kinds of concepts and theories that are out there, there are many, many different ways that political science can contribute to intelligence studies. And here I would just like to point out that Mark Fithian covered a good range of them in his talk, because Mark Fithian is basically, in American terms, a political scientist. Now, in Britain, they don't call it political science. In Britain, they call it politics, but he's coming from the same point of reference. So I'll start with one that Mark Fithian made a kind of a tangential reference to. At the core of both political science and intelligence studies is power, the acquisition, organization, and the use of power. And when you think about political science as power, and you think about intelligence, how does intelligence help in terms of understanding power? Per intelligence theory, the purpose of intelligence is to help provide the information necessary for the effective and efficient employment of power, the application of power, whether that power is offensive or defensive, or political, military, economic, and so on. And once you have power, once you define intelligence, the purpose of intelligence in terms of power, now you have some significant overlaps in terms of political science and intelligence studies. And there's a lot that you can now do with political science concepts and theories. Let's talk about political theory. Political theory can be very useful as a way to establish how different conceptions of the purpose of the state affect how and in what way it employs power. I mean, differences in terms of the purpose of the state, think about the state of nature, the contractarian approach employed by Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, and how that redefines what the purpose of the state is depending on how you think about the state and that state of nature. That can be used to help explain the role and function of the intelligence services in terms of how and why different kinds of states organize and use intelligence services differently in their power acquisition and implementation efforts. Now, political theory has a lot that it can offer intelligence studies, but there's very limited exploitation of political theory in intelligence studies. And Terry Quist has worked on a paper relating philosophy to intelligence studies, but it's not published. It's still a work in progress. John Fox is doing something very similar, political philosophy linked to developing theory of intelligence, but that one is not yet published. I think this is a growth opportunity. This is a growth opportunity for anybody who's aware of the value of political theory and how it can be applied in the space of understanding the role and function of intelligence. Now, in the paper, I transitioned from political theory to international relations theory, and I used a levels of analysis framework derived partly from Kenneth Waltz's Man's The State and War, and Singer's approach from the early 1960s, a way to kind of lay out different levels of analysis and different kinds of international relations theories that apply at different levels. But I'm going to sidestep much of that content, particularly the content about structural or systemic level theories, such as realism or constructivism, for purposes of the talk today, because mostly these structural theories have limited utility for intelligence studies because of their general and abstract nature, which isn't to say they have no utility. They just have less utility than other theories. There have, in general, been few efforts to use systemic level international relations theories to contribute to intelligence studies, with the primary exception being Mark Fithian's exploration of intelligence and structural realism. And as Mark said earlier, you could easily take understandings about intelligence and use them in the development of structural IR theory as a way to better understand power distribution and how that affects and constrains the operations of states. I do think there's value in using structural theories to conceive of power distribution, but I think that individual level theories in international relations have greater applicability in terms of the intelligence studies dimension. So individual level theories explain how individuals can affect state behavior, especially when individuals are not necessarily rational utility maximizing actors with perfect information. And that means all the time. I mean, individuals affect state behavior all the time, which is why CIA has leadership analysts, in order to analyze the degree to which individual leaders shape state behavior. Now, the individual level theories in international relations focus on issues related to perception and misperception, to include biases and heuristics, problems with applying lessons of history, and other explanations for error. And the premier theorist in the space is Robert Jervis. And the fascinating part about Robert Jervis is also one of the premier intelligence studies scholars. He's one of the people who takes international relations theory and applies it to intelligence basically for fun. And he does it in a way that's really insightful and helps us understand intelligence as a function of government in a way that very few others do. And more recently, Karen Yarhi-Milo has explored similar questions to those that Robert Jervis asked, as a way of explaining how intelligence is used to know and understand the adversary, with an emphasis on intentions. Now, this area of research is underdeveloped in both the political science and the intelligence studies space. A lot more could, and I should say should, be said. When you talk about the individual, that necessarily leads you to think about groups and the degree to which groups affect state behavior. Now you're talking about Irving Janis and groupthink and other ways of kind of identifying pathologies in the group context, which then leads you to organizations and thinking about how organizations affect state behavior. And once you're talking about organizations affecting state behavior, now you're into decision making, and now you're into Graham Allison, and you're into the three different models of decision making: the rational actor, the bureaucratic politics, the organizational process. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to evaluate the degree to which intelligence influences decision-making based upon the different kind of decision-making model you're talking about. And there are questions being asked about the degree to which intelligence analysis influences decision-making. Although I don't know that anybody's embracing Graham Allison's models explicitly. But there are those, including Robert Jervis, Josh Rovner, Paul Pillar, and myself, in an evaluation of why strategic intelligence analysis has limited influence on American foreign policy. But political scientists are also starting to embrace this, using political science approaches and concepts as well. Patrick Roberts and Robert Selden just published an article, I think it was in Political Science Quarterly, on why presidents sometimes do not use intelligence. And this is getting us to the heart of the matter regarding the degree to which intelligence actually affects foreign policy, national security, homeland security, the behavior and security of states. More judicious exploitation of theories from political science would provide significant value added on these questions, related to the intersection of knowledge and power, help us better understand the use and the non-use of intelligence in a broader decision-making context. While we're talking about government organizations and the way in which they shape foreign policy and international outcomes, we should also talk about organizational structures and processes themselves. So the subfield of political science called American government. From national institutions and processes to the separation of powers between the branches of government, the invitation to struggle over foreign policy, checks and balances, the role of Congress in terms of its oversight, well, authorization and oversight roles, and the role of the judiciary in determining the constitutionality of intelligence practice. This is functionally the fit of intelligence structures and processes into the framework of the American machinery of government. Some people write about this. Roger Hilsman wrote about this. Harry Howe Ransom wrote about this. Later, Locke Johnson, Amy Ziegert. Not enough. Not as much as you would think there should be. I've previously used Plato's concept of the ship of state as an extended metaphor to explore the role, responsibility, and function of intelligence services in an American governmental context, as a way to look at the actors, the institutions, the processes, and how they help determine the role, function, and performance of governmental intelligence, and vice versa. I think a lot more, what I didn't do when I wrote that paper was borrow directly from the concepts and theories of the American government subfield, but I think somebody should, and I don't think anybody has. So I think this is an opportunity to do so. In 2012 at ISA, I presented a paper on intelligence policy and politics, focusing on the role of the expert analyst in the process. Policy analysis, public administration, basically. I'm getting it ready to submit for publication now, but this is the relationship between politics and policy. And there's a lot more that can be said from the public administration standpoint on how this does work, how it can work, how it should work, and maybe how it can work better. Make one passing reference. There's also an extensive discussion in the context of international relations on bridging the gap between theory and practice. The purpose of this conversation in political science is to ensure that there is an effective transmission belt of knowledge between academia and government. And I know that Brent Durbin's going to be talking about this tomorrow. You have political scientists, including Alexander George, Joseph Nye, Stephen Walt, Bruce Gentleson, David Newsom, Ernest Wilson, and others, who are reflecting on better ways to integrate knowledge from academia into practice. And there's a way in which exploitation of this literature can and has been used to try to make recommendations for bridging the gap between academia or scholarship and practice in the intelligence studies space as well. And maybe the best venue for it are academic intelligence study centers, somewhat similar to this one, where it brings in best practice from the literature on bridging the gap between theory and practice and puts it all in one place. When I proposed the creation of CIA University, it was back in 2000, part of the argument was that it could provide a location for the development of knowledge within the intelligence community context so that it could be exploited by practitioners for improving practice. But the same argument also applies in to academic intelligence study centers, because academia is probably a better venue for this kind of knowledge development in the intelligence studies space. Important caveat, while a purpose of intelligence studies may be to provide policy-relevant knowledge to improve practice, it is not the only purpose of intelligence studies and may not be the most important purpose of intelligence studies. And there we have to come back to Mark Fithian's request for there to be a discussion about the parameters of what intelligence studies is. As a concluding thought, political science is a disciplinary prism which can be of significant value for those who desire to understand, explain, and evaluate intelligence as a function of government, and will continue to be important for the further development of intelligence studies. Thanks.